Let's define an argument as a position on a particular topic defended by a reason. On topic A, I have position B because of reason C. The word reason here, lowercase r, means justification, not to be confused with our power of reason, capital R, which is our faculty for finding truth. But the two are related because, as we'll see, we use inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning to produce justifications. Let's go straight into examples. Say that we inquire about the shape of the Earth. I believe the Earth is round because that is the current scientific consensus. This is a correctly formulated argument. This is the position. This is the supporting reason. I believe the Earth is round. My gut feel tells me so. Still a well-formulated argument. It has a position and a supporting reason, albeit not a very strong one. It's obvious the Earth is round. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It has a position, but the second proposition does not serve to defend it, so it is not an argument. A response to this would be, why is that? What are your reasons for saying this? For anyone who believes the Earth is round, someone else believes it is not. The whole statement sounds like a reason to support a position, but it is unclear what position it is trying to support. Is it claiming that the Earth is not round, or that we cannot know? So, not an argument. A response to this would be, so what? What is your point? An argument can be presented in many formats, but let's talk about a classic one, the syllogism. Consider the following argument. I believe Socrates is mortal because all men are mortal and Socrates is a man. Let's rearrange the following propositions as so. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The first two propositions are called premises and serve to infer the third one called conclusion. Let's deconstruct the argument into its elements. First, we have the key terms, man, mortal, Socrates. Then we have the remaining terms which serve to quantify and connect the key terms. All these terms are put together to form propositions for the premises. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Finally, through logical inference, the conclusion follows from the premises. And that's it. As there are only three basic elements to a syllogism, it follows that there are only three corresponding points of failure called types of fallacy. An ambiguous term, a false premise, and a logical fallacy. Let's dive into each one. Some terms in the common language are already clear. Socrates, mortal, man. Although they can be defined, they do not need to be defined in an argument unless the topic of discussion is specifically about these terms. Other terms are less clear. Justice, love, being. These are made clear by defining them using clear terms. On second thought, let's move the term man on this side. In the modern language, man means adult human males. But in the ancient times, it meant all human beings, such as in the proposition, all men are mortal. Let's proceed to define unclear terms like justice. Although we do not yet know its explicit definition, we know enough about the concept to be able to use it correctly in a sentence. For instance, we know it is just to be honest and unjust to be dishonest under most situations. Thus, we know of cases where the concept applies, as well as cases where it does not apply. By using induction, we can infer a general definition based on our knowledge of these particular cases. The definition must neither be too narrow, otherwise it excludes cases that apply, nor too broad, otherwise it includes cases that do not apply. For instance, we know it is just to give back what we owe, and so that can be our first tentative definition. This is not too broad because it seems that giving back what we owe is generally just. But it is too narrow, for we can think of cases of justice that don't fit the definition, like being honest and friendly. With that, let's be more broad. A good act. This takes into account the first definition, as well as cases of being honest and friendly. It is not too narrow, because it seems that justice is always a good act. But it is now too broad, because there are acts that are seen as good, yet that are not seen as particularly just, like sleeping or eating. These are good acts, but they do not make us virtuous. Treating others as ourselves. This takes into account the previous cases. But it is in fact only fitting when speaking of justice among men, for most people would say it is not just to treat things like plants and God as ourselves, and, conversely, most people would say it is not unjust to treat plants and God differently than ourselves. Oddly, this makes the definition too narrow in one way and too broad in another way, but it is getting close to the mark. Alright, starting with our last definition, and taking into account other beings like plants and God, let us suggest treating a thing as what it is and not as what it is not. In other words, treat God as God and objects as objects. Don't treat God as an object or an object as God. We cannot think of a case that would make the definition too narrow or too broad, so until an exception is brought forth, this becomes the accepted definition of justice. Here is an example of a term that is not too hard to define, yet that is used equivocally, that is to say, has multiple meanings. We shouldn't distrust for no reason. This is true, innocent until proven guilty. But having to take exams to graduate is a form of distrust. This is also true. The purpose of exams is to show that we understand the course. It follows that we shouldn't have to take exams to graduate. That doesn't sound right. The term distrust has two meanings here. It can mean believing someone is dishonest, and the first premise is only true in that first sense, and it can also mean believing someone is honestly mistaken, and the second premise is only true with that second sense. As the term is used equivocally, the conclusion does not follow. Propositions may be particular ones, such as Socrates is a man, and this is a particular fact that can be observed, or general ones, such as all men are mortal. General propositions can be found using a bottom-up approach based on observations and through induction. For instance, as all men we have observed so far have been mortal, we conclude that all men are mortal. Or using a top-down approach through deduction and by appealing to higher unchangeable propositions called principles. For example, when it comes to accusations, a person is either in a state of innocence or a state of guilt. Most of the time, to be guilty is to be guilty of an act, whereas to be innocent requires no act. When you're being accused of something, the first thing you ask is, "What did I do?" You do not ask that when you are considered innocent. Thus, the state of innocence is the simplest of the two states, except in the case of negligence. Appealing to the principle of sufficient reason, in the absence of evidence, it is reasonable to presume innocence as it is the simpler of the two states. Thus, we have the principle called presumption of innocence, presumed innocent until proven guilty. If a principle is disputed, step back to refer to higher principles until you reach a common ground. For example, we make the claim that if there is a first cause to the universe, then it must be the most powerful thing that can exist. This follows from the principle that an effect cannot be greater than its causes, because, relative to the first cause, everything else is an effect. What if this principle is disputed? Then we appeal to a higher principle that nothing comes from nothing. Ex nihilo nihil fit. Everything found in the effect must be found in the cause, otherwise we have more out of less, something out of nothing. What if this principle is disputed? Then we appeal to one of the first principles called sufficient reason, which states that anything that exists demands a sufficient reason or cause for its existence. Well, what if this first principle is disputed? We now have our backs against the wall. It is hard, though not impossible, to defend first principles. And unfortunately, this one has been disputed starting in the 20th century. That said, what we can do is insert a band-aid solution by asking the opponent if, for the sake of argument, can we assume for the time being that this principle is true. This is a temporary solution which serves to move the debate forward with the expectation to come back to it at a later date. And this is precisely what we're going to do here. We will come back to examine this principle in a later video, but for now, if we assume that the principle is true, do we agree that everything else follows? We have already seen in the previous video how logical inferences work on the topic of deduction. In the case of syllogisms, the inference is represented as a Venn diagram. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. A logical fallacy occurs when the conclusion does not follow from the premises. Here is a sample of popular logical fallacies. Ad hominem, attacking the person instead of the argument. Want to hear arguments for Christianity? You just want to convert people to buy yourself a ticket to heaven. Even if that were true, it doesn't change the validity of the arguments. Begging the question, a circular argument in which the conclusion is presupposed in a premise. God exists because the Bible says so, and we can trust a book that was divinely inspired. Claiming that the Bible was divinely inspired presupposes that God exists. Slippery slope. Presuming that if we allow A to happen, then B will necessarily follow, therefore A should not happen. First we'll convert to Christianity, next thing you know, the Crusades are back. Crusades don't have to happen just because we are Christians. It also doesn't make Christianity false. Black or white, where two alternative states are presented as the only possibility, where in fact more possibilities can exist. If I can show you that atheism is flawed, then will you join us? Even if we suppose that atheism is flawed, that doesn't make Christianity true. And the one with the funny name of fallacy. Presuming that if an argument has been refuted, then the position must necessarily be wrong. I have refuted all your arguments. See, Christianity is false. Not necessarily. But it does mean that I have to get back to the drawing board. The list is not exhaustive. Unfortunately, there may exist an infinite amount of logical fallacies, inasmuch as there is an infinite amount of wrong solutions to most math problems, and only one right one. However, fallacies can always be identified by simply asking, does the conclusion logically follow from the premises? And those were the three types of fallacy to a syllogism. Now, a syllogism is one format of argument out of many. That said, all arguments can be reformatted into a syllogism or broken down into many of them. Here's the proof. As we said, an argument is a position on a particular topic defended by a reason. A reason, lowercase r, built by our power of reason, capital R, is built using induction and deduction, and these can always be reformatted into syllogisms. If you want, here's an example that you can read by pausing the video. Therefore, all arguments can be reformatted into syllogisms. Now, syllogisms only have three types of fallacy as discussed. Therefore, all arguments only have three types of fallacy, namely an ambiguous term, a false premise, or a logical fallacy. Thus, the rules of the game are simple. Pass the three types of fallacy when building your own argument, and identify one of the three types when attacking an argument. If no fallacies are found, then the argument stands. For example, Say that someone disputes your claim by saying that it is nonsense, because they have never heard of such a thing. We can reformat this argument as so. I have never heard of this claim, therefore this claim must be false. We complete the syllogism by adding a hidden premise. What I have never heard of must be false. Now, let's check for fallacies. There are no ambiguous terms, everything is pretty clear. No logical fallacies, the conclusion follows from the premises. We can assume that premise 2 is true, the person has never heard of the claim. But premise 1 is false. Just because we've never heard of a claim doesn't make it false. In the next video, we will continue our discussion on arguments from a more practical side. See you then, thanks for watching.